In the fall of 2004, Dan Rather was forced to resign from CBS News, and several members of his staff were fired after they aired a story that questioned President George W. Bush's military service. And they had based their story on a document that turned out to have been fabricated. Now, mind you, there was and there is a great deal of very plausible speculation about some of the details of President Bush's National Guard duty, particularly regarding his early release and possibly spotty record of showing up for duty. But the specific letter, the Killian memo it's called, turned out to be a forgery. And with all the things I've heard reported on news stations that were entirely fabricated in the back room of some propaganda machinery, I couldn't believe that someone as prominent as Dan Rather would be fired for having shown a lack of journalistic integrity in checking his sources in that particular matter. Especially considering that President Bush had sent our armies to war based on documents that showed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and he had not checked the validity of those documents very well. But ironically, he did not lose his job. Former Secretary of Defense Colin Powell has recently published a book challenging the CIA to explain why they put so much stock in the testimony of a source that even they, the CIA, had codenamed Curveball, because the information he provided was so often false. What seemed apparent to me at the time was that Dan Rather was fired for questioning the President of the United States, and they simply found a technicality to justify the action. What he said in an interview shortly after leaving CBS is that the news media had failed generally to challenge the rush to war in Iraq, and that the conspiracy of silence among the major networks amounted to a general failure of the news media to do its job. Because democracy doesn't exist if you don't have good, investigative, courageous reporting on the part of journalism. It's the only real protection we have from the excesses of an autocratic government. Questioning Bush's military record was just a way of sort of nipping at the heels of the commander-in-chief, whom Rather and everyone else in the media had given an undeserved pass in the lead-up to an unnecessary, casualty-riddled, and disastrously expensive war. I was a visiting fellow at Harvard at the time that Rather was dismissed. And that same month, we had a panel in a plenary session in the Divinity School on war and the faith community. The panel was comprised of a Catholic priest, a Muslim imam, a Unitarian pastor, a rabbi, and a Protestant minister. As each took their turn to make their introductory remarks, every single one of these religious leaders expressed their personal opposition to the war in Iraq. And then they ended by offering their excuses for why they had never said anything about their opposition to the war in Iraq in their faith community. The rabbi had members of the synagogue who were concerned about the security of Israel, so they believed any war on their Arab neighbors was justified. The imam had members of his community that had relatives on both the Sunni and the Shia side in Iraq, so he felt it was best not to mention it. The Unitarian had a retired general who was a consultant to military-industrial concerns. And on it went. Religious leaders faced on the one side with a clearly immoral war, and on the other side, faced by congregants who might favor the war, chose simply to be silent, to say nothing. Just like ABC and NBC and CNN and Fox and everyone at CBS, until it was too late to do much about it. I was, in that plenary session, furious, to put it mildly. I had determined when I was going to be away on sabbatical at Harvard that I was going to be well-behaved and not cause any problems. That one day I had a little slip, you understand what I'm saying? Because as a pastor here, I had opposed the war very publicly in public protests and from the pulpit, and had paid a pretty big price for it. These guys and women who were on this panel were serving congregations in Boston, Massachusetts, within blocks of Harvard and the Kennedy School, and they couldn't have been any safer in their careers, and yet they refused to speak their hearts. I understand why they didn't. I mean, I opposed it, and while I was away, gave my critics the opportunity to kind of organize the same fate as Dan Rather suffered, but I'm not bitter. This short passage of Scripture we have before us today from John was written when the church was already in its second or third generation. The expectation of an immediate return of Christ and an end to history was starting to look pretty dubious by the time John's final draft was written. So we have this language of being in the world but not being of it, like resident aliens, sojourning in an empire whose rules, whose laws, whose values are foreign to us. We don't really belong in that empire. The emphasis is on clinging to the truth rather than fitting into the empire. That's always the tension that the faith community has in whatever nation that it appears in. Whether you're a rabbi or an imam in the Middle East, a Buddhist in Asia, a Protestant in America, there is huge pressure brought to bear to go along with the empire. Thomas Jefferson was not necessarily opposed to religion, as many people like to say he was, but he was opposed to the clergy. He had a series of books that he just called Writings, his personal musings, and he writes in the 14th volume, in every country, in every age, the priest has been hostile to liberty. He is always in alliance with whatever despot, abating his abuses in return for protection of his own. That's why so many of us have traced the fall of the Christian church to the 4th century, when Constantine, the emperor, converted to Christianity and made Christianity the religion of the empire. But it's not as if the faithful surrendered all at once, nor is it true that the faithful never came back out of retirement. What is interesting to me in our own century is that religious leaders will so often quote Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, Archbishop Romero, Dorothy Day, Thich Nhat Hanh, Desmond Tutu, but would never do any of the things that those people did. What made each of those people famous was precisely because they stood up for the truth against the laws and power of the empire that they happened to live in at that time. And we adore them for their courage to stand up to the empire. But religious leaders in our setting will bow to the empire so fast, I'm surprised they don't all have whiplash. We don't always need to be a church in protest. We don't always need to be out carrying picket signs or protest signs. There is, after all, a huge difference between being prophetic and just suffering from paranoid delusions. But the proverb is true that says, only dead fish always swim with the current. If you're always fitting into society, your faith is already dead. If we're not willing to stand up to the values of the dominant culture, to protest, even to break immoral laws, then we ought to stop talking about Martin Luther King and Gandhi and Day and Nelson Mandela, because if they had been law-abiding citizens, we never would have heard of any one of them. And you could include Moses and Jesus on that list. As many of you know, I maintain a Facebook page titled The Emerging Church. And if you've never taken a look at it, I encourage you to visit. It's a place that I've created for myself where I can go to chat with other progressive thinkers about unjust war, income disparity, and the insanity of our healthcare system, and the prejudices of the religious right against gays, women, minorities, and people with college educations. And the page has proven to be very useful when I can't find any of you to sit still and listen to me rant for a little while. It's always available to me any hour of the day and night. But Facebook being what Facebook is, you also attract a few people who are at least a bubble off plum. One comment this week in response to, I was writing about the outrageous numbers of Americans that we keep in prison. And this one guy says, all the problems will be solved when the government starts telling the truth about UFOs. Yeah. Now, I'm not sure that I can draw a direct line from that posting on my page to the failure of the Facebook initial stock offering to rise to the anticipated value that they were looking for, but I think it may have something to do with it. Though I have to say that sentence is echoed around in my skull all week this week as a symbol of organized religion. It makes a claim that seems on the surface to be completely insane, and yet you can't really prove him wrong. That's one of the great things about both evangelicals and people that believe in UFOs. They make truth claims that you cannot prove wrong, but you have absolutely no reason to believe are right. And that description would fit most of what I was taught in Sunday school for the first 2 decades of my life. When we say that we are in the world, but we are not of it, with all due respect to the Apostle Paul, that is not a claim that our true home is in a heavenly realm that may or may not exist. It means that we are willing to hold ourselves apart from the mythology of this world and its empires. It isn't that we latch on to absurd otherworldly religious claims. It is that we refuse to play along with the absurd claims of emperors, despots, prime ministers, kings, presidents, their media lackeys, or their pastors and priests. We, who love the truth, must be willing to probe, to question, to challenge, to search for what is really true, no matter what it may cost us. At the homeless shelter where we serve lunch every Thursday and Friday, there's a Native American there who likes for us to call him One Feather. That's not his name, but he likes to be called that. And a lot of people would say that One Feather has a very serious drinking problem, although he would tell you that he doesn't have any problem drinking. But the people around him seem to have some personal problem. He likes to tell us that he was a code talker during World War II, one of those native Navajo tribe who helped to keep military secrets and radio transmissions during World War II. But of course, if he had actually been a code talker, he would be between 90 and 100 years old, and he is not. But we don't challenge his account of things because I know what he's really trying to say. What he really wants us to understand is that he is something more than a drunk who hangs out in a homeless shelter waiting for someone to bring him lunch. He wants us to believe that he is more than his surroundings. And so we greet each other with a loud repetition of the traditional Navajo greeting, Atahe, every Thursday and Friday. Atahe, which is all that I know in Navajo and could be about all he knows in Navajo. I think he's got another 8 or 9 words in vocabulary, but it lets him announce, I am more than what you see here. My life, my personal importance is bigger than these surroundings. And I have to say that that is a lot more than I could say for those religious leaders who sat at that panel at Harvard who were trying to blend into the wallpaper of society while tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people were losing their lives. It is more than I can say for most of the clergy I knew here in Springfield who silently went along with an unjust war. And so, okay, Dan Rather should have checked his facts better, but no one died as a result of his careless error, and that's more than we can say about our national leaders at the time. At least Dan eventually tried to swim against the current a little bit, and he got the usual reward we give for people who refuse to go along. And so I think we have to be prepared to be viewed by the rest of the religious landscape and most of the rest of society as maybe being a little bit crazy, a little bit out of step. Sometimes we are a thorn in the government side, and sometimes we have to be the one who's willing to pay the price of being a prophet. And so, my friends, I beg of you, don't be afraid to be the crazy one. Don't be the one who's afraid to not go along with society. Swim against the current. Love the truth. Pay the price. Yattahe.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.